Hello my quilting friends! My name is Leah Day and welcome to this video for the Machine Quilting Block Party. Today I'm quilting block number 7, our triple tulip block. And this block was pretty challenging to piece, so we're going to try and keep things simple as we learn how to machine quilt it together. So I'm getting started right in the center with the center stem, and I have marked this long curvy line. So I'm just stitching along that, and this is actually the opposite direction that I've done before, and it feels a little weird. So I'm going to rotate around so that way I can see what I'm doing and stitch up for these leaves. It's kind of one of those funny things, you get into a habit of stitching something, and I have always stitched these stems from the vase up, and this time I just happened to be working in the opposite direction. And it's really funny how your brain will kind of react to doing something the opposite way. So I'm going to knock out both of these leaves first, and then I'm going to stitch back up the stem and quilt some of the background design. Now our background design this month is pebbling, and this is a circular design. It's pretty intense, and you want to take your time with it. You also want to try and not stitch it too densely. So I'm going to finish up the stem here, and I'll show you what I mean. So I'm going to do a little bit of travel stitching just to get out of this area and start quilting my circles. So I want to quilt the circles as big as possible, and whenever I quilt where I know that the stem would not cover that fully, I want to grab my marking pencil and just mark the rest of it. So that way when you're looking at the block, it doesn't look like that circle got cut off in a weird way. So I'm just going to mark that opposite side, and that way it'll remind me to go back later when I'm stitching back into that area and to quilt that shape in particular. It's one of those small things, but I really think that makes a big difference on your quilt. So now filling in the rest of the circles, I'm just trying to fit in circles that are as big as possible for the space. And the reason why I want to make them big is because this design gets really dense and intense really easily. So you want to aim for circles that are, an inch or bigger if possible. You can swing around shapes like this. I'm just kind of swinging around in between those two leaf shapes here. Sorry, just blanked on leaf shape. Every once in a while I forget my words here. And so sometimes you can also quilt half circle shapes, and that works too. But just really focus on the largest shape that you can stitch within any space, and then stack them together and understand that travel stitching is absolutely allowed. And you don't have to even form the full shape. Here I'm just stitching a quarter circle shape, and that's going to be a-okay. With this small area, I have a choice. I could quilt a series of small circles, or I could just stitch a gently curving arch. And I think that's a better choice because it's less intense, less small, tiny pebbles all stacked up together. And it also keeps it consistent with the rest of the design. So I have a little space here. I am going to quilt a small pebble into that area. That looks good. And do understand that you can mark this. I included the full marked diagram in your pattern, so you can absolutely mark that if you need it. So now I'm going to do the stem. This is the way I normally do a stem. Up from the bottom and flow all the way back. Just a nice fluid movement. And then up for the stems. So hopefully you can see that using pebbling in the background, you can use that to chain designs together. And what I mean by that is I'm in the stem and I can connect with my background design with the pebbling, and I can use that to flow through that background up to the flowers and quilt the flowers, and then I can keep going. I don't have to stop and break thread. I can just keep moving with the design. So here I'm going to show you how to do that. I'm going to get into the pebbling, and I'm just travel stitching around these circles. And then I get to a space where the design, I need to fill in something to make that look right. So I'm going to fill in a little circle shape, travel stitch up the edge of that stem, and then form my next circle. Now, if you're having trouble forming your circles and visualizing it, the key is to visualize the center point, and then from that center point, you're just you know, that's the center. So you're just focusing on having an equal amount of space all around it. And it might be that I space that out just a little bit big, so it's not going to exactly fit, but that is what my brain and my mind is doing as I'm quilting pebbling. I'm always thinking about that center circle and then how that fits and relates to everything else. And then as I'm stitching it, I'm swinging around to make that shape. And it takes time and practice to stitch circles perfectly. Trust me, it took years. So give yourself a break. If you stitch a lot of ovals, don't beat yourself up, and definitely don't go ripping it out. You know, I really love Angela Walters and her comment, you know, finished is better than perfect. And that is definitely true. It does not have to be perfect. You know, they're just oval, circular shapes. As long as it stacks together, it's going to be a-okay. So here I'm filling in this space completely so that way I can knock out my feathers. And I like to go on ahead and knock out a space completely like this, just simply so I don't have to travel stitch back into it and worry about it later. It's not going to be something that, you know, I look at the quilt and go, oh man, I left that, you know, big giant hole in that area and now I've got to go, you know, pull up thread and stitch that. I really like to go on ahead and fill in all of these little gaps and nooks and crannies before moving on with the design. So I'm going to fill in this one. And again, I'm just visualizing that center circle, that center point, and then swinging around to make it work. And mark it if you need to. It's absolutely allowed to mark any design on your quilt when you need to. Finish that off with a little arch shape. That looks great. And now I'm going to knock out my feathers. So travel stitching over to the center point. And then we can quilt these feathers. And this is a really simple feather fan design. So to quilt this, I'm going to bounce out and kind of do a little bit of a bounce feather. I'm going to bounce back and then bounce to the next one. Come down into the center, and then I'm going to stitch down for the next feather, bounce against the previous one, and then bounce over for that biggest feather. So I just think that that's the easier way to quilt a feather fan like this. It's a little bit faster, a little less travel stitching, but it's totally up to you. I generally do travel back feathers where I'm just like this, traveling down and then branching out with the feather design. That's okay too. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. You just have to kind of get in there and figure out what's going to be the fastest and easiest way for you to fill it. And the nice thing is you can go straight from that feather up to the second feather. And I'm just going to use pebbling to get me there. So stitch a few circles, knock a few circles into that area, and that's going to allow me to move up without having to do very much travel stitching. Sometimes I get a little distracted, I'll be honest. I get a little distracted forming my circles, and then I kind of forget that I'm meaning to work upward and stitch that other feather shape. So if you ever notice that, it's like, well, you know, I'm kind of aiming to get up there, but sometimes stitching all the circles is kind of so fun that I get a little distracted. So here we go. We're up to the second feather shape. And this time I'm going to do all travel back feathers. So come to the center point, branch out and around. Now watch your thread as you're hitting that center point over and over again. That can be a little tricky, and if you start to notice that, and it's also an area of seam allowance too, if you notice that things are tending to kind of gag up on you, be really careful and just stitch up to it but not to that point. So like stop about right there and then swing around again. That will definitely sort out with the number of times we're travel stitching in that area. You won't be able to see that you backed off a little bit. But the good thing is you won't continue to build up so many layers where you might potentially break your thread. So every once in a while, just watch out for that. Any area of intense seam allowance or a lot of thread buildup can be a spot that you might break your thread. So that's how I'm going to finish knocking out this background. It's very simple. I'm just stitching these circles, visualizing how they fit and fill into the space. Pebbling is a great design for this kind of thing where you're fitting it into all the nooks and crannies. I call this a complicated space because it's so tight, especially in here around the flowers. So I'm going to be quilting the pebbling, quilting the flowers and the stems, and I'll meet you back here when you're ready to knock out the vase. The next thing we're going to quilt is the vase, and we're stitching straight lines with rulers. So I've attached a ruler foot. And remember, this foot has a high base so that I can set my ruler against it and use that as a guide. But I need to be careful and remember to drop my needle down with the foot in the down position so that way this needle bar doesn't smash against the top of the foot. You don't want to do that. So always work with the foot in the down position. So now I'm going to drop my needle down in exactly the spot that we need to be. And I'm just looking for how I can line my ruler up. And I've got hash marks for the next set of lines here. So I'm lining up the second line, the line that is one from the edge, lining that up with those hash lines. I'm pressing firmly down on the ruler and guiding both the ruler and the quilt through the machine. I need to press down so that way the ruler doesn't slip out of position, and I also want to press firmly against the ruler foot itself. Now I'm going to travel stitch over to the next set of marks, and I just mark little tick marks that seem to make the most sense to me. You don't need to mark the entire line. It's just simply because you're going to use the ruler as the guide. So this time I'm lining up with the edge of the ruler foot on the line of quilting we just stitched. And I'm just carefully guiding it backwards through the machine. Now, if your machine doesn't like stitching backwards, you might want to rotate, just so that way you can keep working in a direction your machine likes to stitch in. Keep in mind that this is free motion quilting. Even though we're using rulers, a ruler foot is just a different type of darning foot. This is still free motion quilting. I could go into, free motion quilting design like stippling if I wanted to. The only difference is that this high base allows us to put the ruler right up against it and push the whole thing through the machine. So you're going to have to do a little travel stitching in between each line of quilting. So I'm rotating the quilt over. I do that just simply because it makes it just a little bit easier to see where you're stitching with your travel stitching, and it also helps you stay right in the ditch. As I line that up, again, I'm stitching backwards, but I'm just trying to guide the quilt slowly and steadily through the machine. Now in this case, this line is pretty long, so I'm going to reposition my ruler, staying right in line, finish up that line of quilting. That looks good. So that's how I'm going to keep quilting all of the lines in this direction. I'll meet you back here when I've put a few more lines in this quilt and how we're going to quilt over that first set of lines with the second set of diagonal lines to make it look like a grid. So you can see I've started on the second set of lines, ruler foot quilting over the first, and I'm just travel stitching down a bit, getting my needle in the perfect position. And here's a trick. You want to always be paying attention to the edges of your ruler foot, because this ruler foot is exactly a 1/2 inch across, 1/2 inch in diameter, with the needle right in the center. So that means that when the edge of your ruler foot is lined up with a line, that means the lines are going to be stitched exactly a 1/4 inch apart. And that's important because we're stitching lines a 1/4 inch apart here. So it's really handy. I'm lining up my ruler with the line I just stitched, pressing firmly down on the quilt, pressing firmly against the ruler foot, and carefully guiding everything through the machine. Now, I tend to rotate the quilt around quite a lot, and I'm trying not to because somebody always points out, oh, you don't have to rotate. And no, you don't. You absolutely don't need to rotate around. But I gotta say, it really does make things easier when you rotate so that way you can see what you're doing and so it feels the most natural. So I like to rotate, I'll be honest. Even though it might take, I don't know, 3 seconds longer, I feel like that makes my stitching more accurate. And then of course, if my stitching is more accurate, then I feel less impulse to rip my stitches out, which I think saves time. So, you know, I think this is just, it's really kind of up to you. But whenever I'm travel stitching, I do prefer to rotate the quilt so I can see what I'm doing. When it comes to the ruler foot quilting, you really don't have to rotate at all. You can stitch straight backwards if your machine likes it. And that was what I was talking about earlier. If your machine doesn't like stitching backwards, which a lot of home sewing machines really don't like that, that's one of those things you just have to look out for and maybe try and avoid that direction. In this case, you know, rotate it around completely like this, reposition your ruler on the opposite side, and stitch on down. Because the ruler can go on any side. The ruler can even go on the front of the foot too. Let me show you what that's like. It's a little weird, I gotta say, but I could put the foot just like this and maybe see if it would help me with that travel stitching. So lots of things that you can do with it. And you can find these rulers, they are the Dresden plate templates on my website at leahday.com. The last part of the block is the border, and I'm getting started here with one of the corner circles, circle spiral. So I stitch that circle, and I like to swing around it one more time just to build up the thread, make it stand out really nicely on the quilt surface. And then I'm going to work my way inside to quilt the spiral. So this is a closed spiral, which means I'm going to quilt all the way to the center, and then I'm going to travel stitch my way back out again. So as you're travel stitching, just slow down, take it easy, try and stay right on top of that line. Slow and steady really wins the race. If you wobble a little bit, don't worry about it. Just go back and throw a little bit more thread at it, stitch over it again. It'll just make it stand out that much better. Okay, so now I'm going to rotate the block around and I'll talk you through our echo shell border, or little rainbows. So you do your outer rainbow shape first. I like to do that first, but you could also work from the smallest rainbows and work outward too. It's totally up to you. I'm going to travel stitch over and quilt that echo. And I've left my ruler foot on here, so you could use the edges of the ruler foot as a guide, I guess, if you wanted to. Just to kind of help you visualize these echoes as you stitch inside. So just careful travel stitching and stitching those arch shapes, and then I'll travel stitch down to reach the next one. So that's how I'm going to knock out the border, and here's what it looks like whenever you finish block number 7. So that's it for this video. If you'd like to find the quilting diagram so you can mark your block and follow along step by step, you can find it in the block number 7 quilt pattern at leahday.com/block party. I include a full-size template so you can mark all of the designs on your block and be able to quilt really easily. It's one of those things I think is really important about machine quilting when you're first getting started, is take the guesswork out of it. You know, having the lines marked on your quilt really makes it easier. You don't have to think so much about how the design's going to fit into a space. You can just stitch on the marked lines, and that really works good. So if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it with your friends. That really helps me out a lot. And of course, if you have any questions, please ask in the comments below. I'm here to help you learn more about quilting. Until next time, let's go quilt.